Okay, I had provided the wrong path to the player in previous tutorial. It is the correct path, and now the server is running and everything is good. Also, I'm sorry for the bad audio and background noises, so please bear with it. Okay, now let's see how things are done in the client side. But first we would have to initialize our server as a Git repo. It is not done for us by Colyseus as React does. So let's stop our server, Control C, and here we go, Git init, and our server is initialized. Now let's create our Colyseus client. For this we need to create a React app as usual. I have already created mine. Remove some redundant files and code that we won't be using. So let's remove all these. Inside of src, we won't be using these styling.css and .test files. Also, readme.md is no good for us. Okay, now everything is good. I'll be adding Bootstrap as a CSS framework as I'm awful at styling. So let's add this Bootstrap link in index.html. Let's remove this redundant code first. I'll be adding the link. Now let's create our components folder where we'll be storing our component files in src folder. Create a home.jsx component for our home page. I will be using this RAFCE template for a React component. It is provided by A7 extension for VS Code. Now let's remove the redundant code from app.js. We'll be rendering our home component in app.js. It is imported automatically. Remove the redundant code from index.js also. Now we can go on with home.jsx. Let's create some states for the user to fill in. So I have to import useState for that. Okay, I knew it would happen. Now name input is for the name of the user. So let's create a state with name input. And ensure that you use camel case notation. The initial value of the name would be a null string or an empty string. Also, if the user wants to join a room, he will have to enter a room code. For that, we will be creating a room code input state. So room code input. Okay. Ensure to use camel case notation here also. Now I'll be pasting this form UI to save some time. Inside return okay, why am I getting okay? This function we will define in a bit later. Now everything is good. Now let's render our client. Let's run our client. Let's also run the server. It is usual to take some time for the React app to run. I'll be pausing till it is running. You can see the UI is rendered and it obviously won't work as we haven't connected it with Coleus. So join room and create room will not be working. Now we will be installing and importing our Coleus client. Open a new terminal and install Coleus client using command npm I or install --save coleus.js. Hit enter and you have to wait a while. I'll be pausing. Okay, now let's create some global states for our room and Coleus client. I will be using context API for this purpose. Create a new file called game context in src folder. I'll be creating a context here called game context. And I see I made another mistake of installing Coleus in the global folder. I should be installing inside of client. First I need to delete these files. and I will installing this Coliseus in my client. Hit enter, and I'll be waiting for a while and pausing the video. It took a bit longer than usual. Okay, now let's import React from React. We also need to import create context to create our context. Now let's create our game context. We need to use create context to create our game context. With an initial value of null. Now I will be defining some states inside of our state provider. So let's create a state provider with the name game provider. This will be a arrow function. So let's pass the arguments as the props. And now we will be defining our states inside of this game provider. So the first state would be our client. So I had to import useState to define states. Now define our client state. Ensure to use camel case notation. Also the client would be initially null, so give null as the initial value. Then we need to define our room state. I'll be duplicating this line. The room will be an object with unique IDs, so let's give this an empty object with a key call ID, and the initial value of that key will be null string or an empty string. So now the room will be defined by a room ID.